Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 323, in the case of the anti-Soviet Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites, Part 2. Last time, we covered the first part of the trial of the 21 men accused of conspiring against the Soviet Union and plotting to murder the leadership of the country. Today, we continue following the transcript of their trial and finish up the series. The opening session of the second day of the trial, held on March 3, 1938, begins with the testimony of Vladimir Ivanov. He would admit to being recruited by the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, starting in 1911, when Ivanov was an 8th grader in a school in Tula, a city about 120 miles south of Moscow. This is not a surprising revelation, as many Bolsheviks were double agents, including Yakub Zhitomirsky, a leading Bolshevik and close associate of Vladimir Lenin, Yevno Azev, Roman Malinowski, and Dmitry Bagrov were others. There was even talk of Joseph Stalin being one, but the evidence of that is kind of sketchy, although he could have ordered any evidence destroyed. But all of that is the focus of another not-too-distant episode. After getting Ivanov to admit being a double agent, the prosecutor, Andrei Vyzhinsky, steered the witness into implicating Nikolai Bukharin. Here is when a series of gaps in facts become clear. Ivanov claims that Bukharin, Rykov, and himself planned to overthrow Stalin and the Soviet government. He admitted they met in places in person where they could not possibly have been together. Of course, this really didn't matter, as all of the defendants were going to be found guilty anyway. After a short 20-minute recess, Vyzhinsky called on Bukharin to take the stand. Nikolai Bukharin was one of the main targets of the prosecution, despite being a key figure in the previous show trials against people like Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. He aligned with Stalin during that early period of the Great Purge, during the trial known as, quote, the Trotskyite, Kamenevite, Zinoviite leftist counter-revolutionary bloc. It's a mouthful, I could say. It was held in August 1936. And there's ample evidence to suggest that those men in that trial, also known as the First Moscow Show Trial, did indeed want to get rid of Stalin from the country, but the extent of that involvement was likely way overstated. The problem we have with any of the testimony is how much was pure, unadulterated fabrication, how much was just the mouthing of men who were tortured unmercifully, and how much of it was actually true. Bukharin's testimony was about as combative as was possible under the circumstances. He knew that if he disagreed with Vyzhinsky's assertions, his wife, Anna Larina, would be in grave danger. She would survive, even though she spent many years in exile and in prison. She describes her time this way, quote, in December 1938, I was returning into investigative prison in Moscow following a year and a half of arrests and imprisonments. First came exile in Astrakhan, then arrest and imprisonment there. Next, I was sent to a camp in Tomsk for family members of so-called enemies of the people. On the way, I was held in transit cells in Saratov and Sverdlovsk. After several months in Tomsk, I was arrested a second time and sent to an isolation prison in Novosibirsk. From there, I was transferred to a prison near Kemerovo, where after 3 months, I was put on the train back to Moscow. She would spend 20 years in the Gulag system, but she would hold her husband's last testament to memory, as writing it down could have cost her life. She would recount it in print in 1988, 8 years before she died at the age of 82. Bukharin was rehabilitated in 1988 under Mikhail Gorbachev. Accusing Bukharin of being anti-Soviet would be akin to accusing former President of the United States, John Adams, of being anti-American. Bukharin was one of the true intellectuals guiding the early days of Bolshevik rule. His major concern, though, was the violent nature of the 1930s under Stalin, as he viewed it as unnecessary to achieve the communist utopia Bukharin so believed in. Next up on the stand would be Prokopy Zubarev. His testimony was focused on another critical figure, former premier Alexei Rykov, as well as his own supposed involvement in the overall conspiracy. Zubarev would admit to being an Okhrana agent beginning in 1908. Looking at his history and age, it is entirely possible and probably likely that this accusation was true. The other charge was that he was one of the leading causes of the disruption of food distribution and planting while the deputy of the People's Commissariat of Agriculture in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. I just truly love these really long names of departments in the Soviet times. It was truly, as I said before, a mouthful. Now, Zubarov was an important scapegoat for Stalin as he needed to find blame for the disastrous policy of collectivization, which started in 1928. Millions died of starvation, especially in Ukraine during this period, which lasted until 1940. Many of the commissars were swept up in the Great Purge, including Vladimir Milutin, Andrei Kolegayev, Vasily Yakovenko, Mikhail Chernov, Robert Icke, and Yakov Yakolov. This last person was very close to Stalin, which made his inclusion of those who would be executed highly unusual. Yakolov was one of the staunchest promoters of that quack biologist Trofim Lysenko. He was also one of the architects of the genocidal Holodomor. So it is kind of likely that Stalin pointed at him instead of taking responsibility himself. When you read Zubarev's testimony, it is apparent that he was fed his lines, implicating himself above and beyond what was realistic. When the prosecutor Wyszynski asked, quote, "What was the nature of your criminal activities in the People's Commissariat of Agriculture of the RSFSR?" Zubarev's response was this, quote, "Here, my criminal activities consisted first of all in wrongly planning the sowing of vegetables. In particular, little attention was paid to the development of vegetable growing in our eastern districts, where the development of vegetable growing was of enormous importance, especially in view of the development of industry." Here he implicates himself as a wrecker of agriculture, which led to the starvation of millions. In the evening session of March 3rd, 1938, Wyszynski would grill two men, Christian Rakovsky and Nikolai Kristinsky. His goal was to have them turn on each other and force them to admit they were Trotskyites. This was seemingly important as Kristinsky had earlier denied his guilt. In all likelihood, he was tortured between his dual testimonies, as shown by his comments in the evening session. Quote, "Yesterday, under the influence of a momentary keen feeling of false shame, evoked by an atmosphere of the dock and the painful impression created by the public reading of the indictment, which was aggravated by my poor health, I could not bring myself to tell the truth. I could not bring myself to say that I was guilty. And instead of saying, 'Yes, I am guilty,' I almost mechanically answered, 'No, I am not guilty.'" Wyszynski then began to turn the interrogation toward Genrikh Yagoda. He began by questioning Alexei Rykov about his relationship with Yagoda, which he said began in 1928. Rykov claimed that Yagoda, in his position as the head of the OGPU, the Soviet secret police at the time, protected all of the bloc of rightists and Trotskyites from arrest and interrogation. Yagoda would confirm this, but differ as to how they portrayed his involvement. This short testimony would end with Yagoda nervously leaving the stand. After Rykov and Bukharin made more admissions of guilt, the court adjourned until the morning of March 4th. Wyszynski then turned to the former first secretary of the Belarusian SSR, Vasily Sharangovich. I find his prosecution quite baffling, as he was a strong advocate of Stalin and helped with numerous purges in Belarus. In his testimony, he claimed to have become a spy for Poland in 1921. He was part of a prisoner of war swap after fighting between the Red Army and Poland ended. As the questioning continued, it is interesting to note that the supposed attorneys for the defendants did not cross-examine. The court records show a lot of cross-blaming, tying each member of the conspiracy to each other. Rosengolz and Krestinsky then began to testify that General Tukhachevsky, who had already been executed, by the way, had planned to overthrow the government along with a number of other military personnel in retaliation for the execution of Pyatakov earlier in 1937. Stalin needed to show the world that he needed to really purge the military as they were a major threat to his leadership. Of course, it was entirely possible that this was indeed true, but it is unlikely it was as extensive of a plot as they claimed in the secret trials of the military generals that occurred in July 1937. This trial was to cost the lives of 8 generals. Of the 10 judges who sat on the military trial, 7 were either executed or committed suicide within a year of this trial. Krestinsky was probably one of the most long-winded of the 21 defendants. Even the president of the trial, Vasily Ulrich, was kind of annoyed. He would say, quote, "Accused Krestinsky, please continue, only make it shorter. Do not dwell on the circumstances with regard to which you have already made replies." So what does he do after that admonition? Krestinsky goes on one of the most extended rants of all. He had initially pled not guilty, as I said before, but likely under torture decided to change his plea on the 4th day of the trial. Krestinsky admitted to being a German spy from 1923 onwards. And this is highly plausible, as the German government at the time, led by Friedrich Ebert, was engaged in crushing a number of communists during his tenure between 1921 and 1925. Christian Rakovsky, the former ambassador to Great Britain and France, would be the next person on the stand. He would implicate himself as one of the major instigators of the alleged plan to overthrow the government. He did make it a point to implicate Leon Trotsky as the one who was the real leader of the plot. Rakovsky also admitted that he had talked to the Japanese government. He would also claim that he was in contact with both the British and Japanese intelligence services. In addition, he would claim further talks with the Germans, although much of this testimony was pretty vague and, to me, very unconvincing. Still, Wyszynski would talk it all in and claim all of his plots and plans were carefully orchestrated by Trotsky. Additionally, several of the defendants began to point fingers at some of the countries within the Soviet Union as being disloyal and harboring deep-seated nationalistic feelings. They mentioned countries from Central Asia like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. This was important, as Stalin needed this to come to light, as he had plans to force the inhabitants of the countries to relocate, losing their ability to stoke nationalism in their respective countries. By March 7th, more countries within the Soviet Union were being blamed as disloyal. In his testimony, Bukharin talks about Belarus and Ukraine being pushed to split from the USSR, backed by the German government, around 1930 and 1931. By this point, Bukharin seems to be getting annoyed by the line of questioning that Wyszynski is taking. Of course, the prosecutor was having none of this and would angrily berate Bukharin time and time again. Bukharin, by this juncture, had thought he had a deal in place to spare his life because of conversations that he had with Anastas Mikoyan and Vyacheslav Molotov. It was a delusional belief, as they had no intention of being lenient towards Bukharin. This would become more apparent in the evening session of March 7th. For the first time, witnesses who were not yet indicted would be put on the stand. The first one was Varvara Yakovleva, followed by Nikolai Osnik, Boris Kamkov, and Vasily Mantsev. All three were under arrest at the time of their testimony, and all three would be executed within a year afterward. They all likely believed that they would get a lighter sentence in return for implicating the defendants in this trial. But of course, this was not the case. Kamkov was the only one to refuse to implicate Bukharin in the attempt to assassinate Vladimir Lenin. This is despite being tortured by the OGPU. While he admitted that his group, the left communists, were opposed to Lenin signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany to end their participation in World War I, he denied that they had plans to kill anyone in response. At this point, in the morning session on March 7, 1938, Vyshinsky began to lay out the case against the defendants regarding the deaths of Maxim Gorky, his son Maxim Peshkov, Valerian Kubiashev, and Vyacheslav Mizhinsky. All of these cases were dubious as they all had underlying illnesses that more than likely led to their deaths. When it came to Gorky, though, it is highly likely that Stalin ordered his death as he became a growing pain in his side. At the trial, Pyotr Krychkov, Gorky's longtime assistant, admitted to poisoning him following the orders from Genrikh Yagoda. The interrogation of the accused would begin on March 8th during the morning session. Lev Levin, a Moscow-based physician, was the first to take the stand. He began by implicating Yagoda as the director of the murder of Gorky and his son, as well as Menzhinsky. Yagoda, for his part, denied that he had known Levin before the trial, although he did acknowledge that he eventually did order that Levin, quote, bring about the death of Alexei Maximovich Gorky and Kubichev. Yagoda was then confronted with the death of Menzhinsky, who was the head of the OGPU, and Yagoda, of course, would benefit from his death. Yagoda denied this, but was presented with his deposition in December 1937. It stated, quote, it is a known fact that during his last years, Menzhinsky was more often ill than at work. I directed the work. It was clear that after his death, I would become chairman of the OGPU. I became accustomed to this idea and was waiting for Menzhinsky's death, but he would not die. When I instructed Levin to get Max out of the way... Well, as for the murder of Maxim Peshkov, I found it really interesting in the way they killed him. They encouraged him to drink more alcohol, which Levin claims that Peshkov was unable to process like a normal person. When Maxim was in a weakened state, he developed pneumonia and died. When it came to the death of Menzhinsky, Levin and Kazakov just began to treat his already damaged heart with stimulants that accelerated the disease process, leading to a fatal heart attack. They used a similar attack, causing Kubichev to have a heart attack as well. When it came to Maxim Gorky, when he came down with the flu, they treated him with the proper medications, but they upped the dosage to a level that would be fatal. During the evening session on March 8th, the court began to tie Yagoda to Hitler as they accused him of being infatuated with the German dictator. While questioning Bulanov, he claimed that, quote, In this connection, I recall a parallel which Yagada drew between the future secretary of the Central Committee, Buchan, and Goebbels. I must say that, in general, Yagada was much infatuated with Hitler. Wyszynski then asked, quote, he was infatuated with fascism generally? But in particular? Bulanov replied, quote, he was infatuated with Hitler and said his book, My Struggle, was really worthwhile to look at. What becomes apparent in the subsequent testimony of Yagada is how he lays out the planning of a palace coup to overthrow the Soviet government beginning in 1931. This is important as this is when Stalin began to firmly tighten his grip on power and started the process of eliminating most of his threats, you might say. These threats, of course, were the old Bolsheviks, and Stalin really viewed them as being a threat to his power, and they likely were. Next up was to memorialize the methods of murdering Gorky, Kubachev, Menzinsky, and Peshkov. Then they turned toward the attempted poisoning of Yagada's successor, Nikolai Yezhov. Now, Yezhov, of course, would be executed just a few years later, but he was the one that took over from Yagada by Stalin's appointment. Now, they claim that, quote, on the basis of the chemical analysis of the carpet, curtains, upholstery, and the air in Comrade N.I. Yezhov's office, as well as analysis of his urine and the nature of the morbid symptoms which he manifested, it must be taken as absolutely established that the poisoning of Comrade N.I. Yezhov by mercury absorbed through the respiratory tracts, the most potent and dangerous method of chronic mercurial poisoning, was organized and put into execution. They then laid the blame entirely on Yagada and Bulanov. When the trial resumed on March 11th, it was now all in Wyszynski's lap. He would lay out all of the charges and what each man's crime that they were responsible for. The transcript of this part would go on for 72 pages. During the evening session, the defense led by I.D. Braude was allowed to make the case for Dr. Levin. He basically threw everyone else under the bus, especially Yagada. The court then allowed each of the defendants the right to make a speech in their defense. Most did. Their pleas were really admissions of guilt, but they did, for the most part, beg to be allowed to live. At 9:25 p.m. on March 12, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR went into a separate room to, quote-unquote, deliberate the verdict. They finished at 4 a.m. on March 13th. All of the defendants were found guilty. 18 were to be executed immediately after the trial, with only Pletnev, Rakowski, and Bessonov spared for the moment instead of being sent to the Gulag. They would be executed a few years later, as would the majority of the judges who handed down the verdict. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we cover a completely different topic, the Raskol, the schism within the Russian Orthodox Church, the splitting of the Russian Church into an official church, and the Old Believers movement in the 1600s. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.